So I'm tasked with waking you up after lunch. I'll do my best. I don't know if I can be as entertaining as Larry, but I'll work at it. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Mike. It's a conference I've wanted to come to for a long time, and for you to invite Jack Rakoff is a wonderful opportunity because he has obviously perspectives on these issues in this period in ways and expertise that I'm fortunate to be the beneficiary of. In fact, I read the chapter on presidential power in original meanings on the plane on the way out, and have already got even more grist for my mill. So thank you for that, absolutely. So one of the things that there's a burgeoning literature on James Wilson, and Randy is teasing me. It's like, well, I teach at Penn. Of course, I have to talk about James Wilson. He's the first Penn Law professor, but what people don't know is he gave one set of lectures, then left, and then the school did not exist for roughly a century. So you can claim a certain degree of continuity, but it's sort of abstract. What's more interesting to me is that there is a small literature brewing that say he's sort of one of the lost founders. I mean, some things that people don't really know. He wrote an early pamphlet in the late 1760s, which anticipated many of the arguments, and back before these were at all vogue. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson copied them into his commonplace book. And in fact, the language they largely think was directly responsible for the "We hold these truths" section of the Declaration of Independence. There's a fascinating story. He actually opposed the radical Constitution of Pennsylvania because of legislative supremacy, and as an attorney defended some Quakers and Tories who were accused of being traitors shortly after the British were ejected from Philadelphia, at which point a bunch of drunken people within Philadelphia decided, as a mob armed with guns, stormed his house, in which case, and he had a number of friends he had on the other side, fought back. Several people were bayoneted and 6 people were killed. It's a really bizarre, I mean, the stakes were a little bit higher back then. He actually helped Pennsylvania endorse independence. They were bound not to do it. They were voting 4-3, and then the next day they came back and they voted again. And they voted 3-2 in favor of it, with 2 of the people on the delegation physically present but declining to vote, and was widely credited with orchestrating that. And member of the Continental Congress, he actually in the convention gave the second most speeches. He was the drafter of the first drafts in the Committee of Detail, which is responsible. If you look at the original resolutions out of Virginia, they're remarkably spare. Things such as enumerated powers, necessary and proper clause, supremacy clause, the specific fonts of jurisdiction in Article 3, the full faith and credit, privileges and immunities, and the guarantee clause all apparently came from the process that Wilson led. He wrote pamphlets that they say during the ratification phase were more influential than the Federalist Papers. A Supreme Court justice who had a penchant for land speculation. While riding circuit, he actually was arrested by sheriffs and thrown into debtor's prison in New Jersey. Fled to North Carolina at the home of James Iredell, where he died a pauper, relatively young, shortly after having a stroke. So he's a very, very interesting man who actually, just on a personal level, but actually in terms of the things that we care about, is really much more influential than people normally give him credit for. So why do we care particularly? He is acknowledged to be the father of the executive in the Constitution. If you read the Virginia resolutions, they're remarkably spare. There will be a national executive, and Madison in his letters flat out said, I really haven't thought that much about this yet. He hadn't really framed it out. And in fact, he really was the most influential person in terms of shaping how these debates went. Now, there's a couple sections of the paper that are missing just because I didn't have time to write them that I think that need to be there. One is setting a stage, looking at the early state constitutions and looking at the early federal executive under the Continental Congress and subsequently under the Articles of Confederation. In fact, what you start to see is that in the early state constitutions, they actually embraced either legislative supremacy or strict separation of powers. And there's a latent distrust of democracy. They talked about democratical despotisms. And in fact, they really had an early spirit that showed up in the early constitutions that changed dramatically in the later constitutions in New York and Massachusetts. And when people say that the colonists were suspicious or the newly freed states were suspicious of executive power. Anyone going back to Thatch realized that there's a vector that goes through these, and that in fact that began to wane. There's also a wonderful history about the early federal executive where Washington bitterly complains about the number of committees and the fact that they're constantly changing, and how in order to have proper energy and dispatch, you need single-headed agencies, and you needed actually people with individual responsibility. That very much became the texture that came part of the convention. You have the paper, so I won't go into great length, but in fact, most people look at the executive and the rejection multiple times of triumvirate and focus almost entirely on that, saying that this is an endorsement of the unitary executive. What's interesting to me is the history. Is if you actually look, there were two other things that I think are very interesting. A parallel narrative where they kept trying to append an advisory council, often compared to the Privy Council in Britain. And in fact, Wilson consistently opposes them until very late in the convention, when he actually endorses the idea shortly after the committee votes to include the Senate in confirming appointments, and there's a whole little saga that goes about that. And the second is that regarding the veto, they actually wanted the president to sit with the judiciary as part of a council of revision to look at legislation as a check on legislatures, and that in fact what you see is a very different conception of the separation of powers than is often portrayed in the literature. So what do I take of all this? Well, first is, I think that this episode really helped me unravel a really key element of what M.J.C. Weil calls the unique contribution of the United States to the idea of separation of powers. And the real motive you go through is really interesting, because people look at mixed government and they think about it as balanced and all these different interactions. And the key insight about mixed government is it really wasn't, it was about governments based on different classes of people. The idea is you wanted crown, aristocracy, and commons, and the mediating principle was not sort of their electoral, their essential functions a la Montesquieu, but really what their social makeup was. And it was supposed to represent different points of view. Now, this wasn't going to get you very far in the early US, but without a strong model, they then turned to Montesquieu with this strong notion of separation of powers, without an idea of checks and balances and no real way to admit them conceptually. And so, in fact, we saw different states experiment with this, largely without success. And so, to me, you get this move away from this royalist or aristocratic vision, which always struck me when I read Adams' early stuff, where I liked a lot of the criticisms he made, but there's clearly this old world class-based ethic that goes through a lot of the writing. And then you see, on the one hand, the Jeffersonians, who have this very diffuse notion, but they're all both sides are very suspicious of centralized power and democratic power. And to me, what you see articulated by Wilson is a very functionally based vision of this, which isn't based on a definition of powers qua powers, but on a more ad hoc balancing of how things are going. What's fascinating is, that we see the motives, that the drive that happens, that there's no direct references with Montesquieu, Locke, or Blackstone, even though we clearly know they all read them. And that Madison says something very early in the discussion that says, well, before we decide how to structure the president's going to be elected, shouldn't we know what the powers are going to be? And the clear suggestion is that that's very much up for grabs, even though it's the executive, and that the clear motive, and this is something that Jack points out beautifully in his book, is that the real beneficiary of the executive was the beneficiary of the strong Senate and the reaction during the ratification phase to the fact, or the later parts of the convention, the fact that people thought it was too strong. And if you look at the ratification discussions, which really point out that the concern was that the Senate, the president would be subservient to the Senate because the Senate was too strong in the way it was structured. So what we have is a very different vision of the separation of powers, where it's not really based on their essential qualities, but a more open sharing of the powers. And the question is, well, what's going to inform how these are going to go? One is Wilson is the most consistent Democrat, in my opinion, in the convention. I mean, he believed in a whole bunch of basic principles. One of the things that is fascinating to me is separation of powers tells you a lot of things. It doesn't explain bicameralism. It doesn't actually tell you how presidents and judges should be selected. And to say things are separated, you should separate powers, begs a number of very, very important structural questions in a government. And Wilson actually had answers for all these. He wanted a broad franchise, direct election of the president, direct election of senators. And all these things to modernize are very, very natural. and aged very, very well. And what's fascinating is it didn't go over well at all at that time, because neither the Jeffersonians nor the Federalists had any interest in any of these positions. And so what's fascinating is he actually favored straight proportional representation, ratification by state conventions, and this notion that the president is the man of the people. And the other fascinating thing is he actually gives a fairly mature political science-y take on how institutions should be constructed. The optimal size of representative districts and how that affects participation. He believed that there was an educative function in participation. He believed that large districts were less likely to elect people to capture, basically, the way we think about it in modern terms. And he had a structural idea that informed how he balanced the powers, which I think was interesting. And that's in addition to the traditional notions we have about energy and dispatch in the executive, which is part of the more conventional narrative. And the other thing that's actually underdeveloped in the paper is this notion of nationalism. He did write some memos that anticipated that were used actively in the defense of the Bank of the United States. He did see a strong country knit by credit, no doubt informed by his penchant for land speculation and his need for effective ladders of credit markets and all that, which got him into enormous trouble. And but in many senses, the vision of the country reflected in the modern polity is really Wilson's, much more so than Madison, who normally gets the credit. So a couple implications I'll say before I stop here, which is, one is that to say that Wilson and Wilson specifically and the convention more generally engaged in an active discussion about how we should balance powers to make a good polity is itself says nothing about what the content of executive power is, and remarkably said very little about what inherent executive power, the scope of it, is. To say that, and in a sense, some of the discussions we've had, these should be tied together. Wilson believed that actually a fairly narrow set of executive powers. He believed in the power to execute the laws and the power of appointment. And you can see what's happening here is when he loses the appointment battle, where that becomes a shared power, it's interesting that that's when he starts to change his position on a number of other issues. And in my opinion, it explains why the emphasis comes on removal, because if the appointment of power is an essential part of making sure the executive works well, in the absence of a clean appointment power, maybe you need the strong removal power. The other thing that's interesting to me is many people might take this that, oh, we're balancing, this is a blanket invitation to rewrite provisions in a functionalist sort of way. That's not how I take this at all. My point is that in fact, they had an argument about needing sufficient powers to defend and balancing the powers, but this is a constitution, and in fact, it's intended to have more enduring qualities, and just because it's open for framers to rebalance them in a political sciencey sort of way as a matter of institutional design, does not open the door for legislatures to in fact, shuts the door on them reallocating those powers because it creates a particular balance that they intended to carry through. That's it.